Hey, it's Stu, and this is going to be a reading review video. So in my reviews, I sometimes remember to give a synopsis, but I'm kind of a reader that doesn't like to know that much about a book going in. Um, but what I like to do is just kind of give my thoughts. Mostly what I really liked about the book, sometimes what I didn't quite work for me about a book, and sometimes in doing that, the synopsis comes along. Um, I am a reader that, of course, cares about the perfect blend of beautiful prose and plot and setting and character development and theme. But what a story is about tends to be less important to me in any case. Like when people say, what is that book about? I often kind of freeze, like, do you want the plot points or do you want the themes? And you'll notice kind of on the synopsis, they give you a bit of both. That was the end of my ramble. Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead by Olga Tokarczuk. It was the first book that I read in the series of books that I'm going to talk about. I read it in a day, and it is a very propulsive read. I had to take a little bit of an interlude and read some Blake. Really, this book, up until including the title, is a huge sort of homage to Blake. And I was only familiar with Blake because Chris Christopherson was a Rhodes Scholar of William Blake. And so that's like how I knew about Blake. I caught the interesting capitalization, as probably most readers did, right from the beginning. And then it made me wonder, was that a thing that Blake did? And indeed it was. I took a little interlude to read some of his poems, although, every chapter of this book starts with a little bit of Blake. Olga is such a perfect blend of pushing his story along, really developing a setting, introducing some very, I might even say eccentric, or characters that can't rely on tropes and stereotypes at all in the character development because of their sort of eccentricity, and then layering in all the literary fiction with a capital L, right? It's Olga is as lit fic as it comes, up until and including how does one read this book without some anchorage in Blake, right? I loved this is also the book that is the master class of weird girl lit. It just gives you so much to think about. How Olga also includes things in this book. There's a reference to a trial where some rats were put on trial, and they ended up being acquitted because, if I remember correctly, they couldn't show up to defend themselves. And it just seems so random. And of course, I was like, okay, that's got to be real. It had to have really happened, as absurd as it is. So I looked it up, and unless my sources, which, how am I going to know if it's a super credible source on the internet, could have even made the foible of looking at AI. It really happened. There was a trial in Italy of some rats, which is mentioned in this book. Olga stays. So one of the few, there's only a few authors that I've decided to keep. And then there's only a few books outside of the authorship that I know deserve and need a reread. And this, of course, deserves a reread. Having read it kind of very close to The Impusium, I have to actually say, I think I'm glad that The Impusium was my first Olga book. And I might even venture to say that I liked The Impusium more. If you want to dabble into lit fic, but a little bit of a suspense, some the plot, there really is a propulsive plot in this book. And it's got some real atmospheric suspense vibes and you're kind of into weird girl lit, I think this is the book for you, probably because it's so literary fiction that maybe you like The Impusium is, too capital L lit fic. It was such an interesting book to read with the novella that I read next, which was related to the International Booker. So was this. This was International Booker nominated. I believe it didn't win. Flights is the one that won. But then I read Ana Paula Maya's On Earth as It Is Beneath, translated by Padma Vishwanthan. Oh. Who's the translator? Oh, let's switch translators, right? Books of Jacobs. Yeah, Book of Jacobs was a different. This was Antonia Lloyd-Jones, the translator for this. Okay. On Earth as It Is Beneath. So, On Earth as It Is Beneath is rather macabre, and it's short, and it's very masculine and brutal, and also in just like kind of this extreme, isolated setting. Also quite masculine and brutal in ways that are highly criticized. There's a thing about building on top of bones, right? On top of bones, on top of historical wrongs in both of these books. On Earth as It Is Beneath, we're looking at a penal colony that's really isolated, and we get into sort of like a Hunger Games vibe. They're not children. Yeah, I thought that it was such a good book to read right along. I thought the conversation that these two books had with each other was fantastic. And yeah, I think if you can if you can handle like kind of Cormac McCarthy style brutality, then this book would also, I think, On Earth as It Is Beneath, like Cormac McCarthy fans, as I am, would enjoy this book. Okay, then I moved on to something happier, maybe. Oh yeah, I was listening to Behind the Scenes at the Museum by Kate Atkinson, which was quite sprawling. This book wasn't at all what I thought it was going to be. We do get a young person's point of view kind of throughout her childhood and then young adulthood, and then into the passing of her mother. We get to know, and then there's they're called literally footnotes. So we get to know this girl and her family, her nuclear family, her sisters and her parents. And it was that mom. I just, the mom, oh my gosh, why I can't, Bunty. Bunty was one of those characters that's like, I didn't like her. She was not a warm and fuzzy mom to our protagonist, but then I kind of came to understand her. I thought Kate Atkinson really worked like the complexity of humans quite well. There was a fair amount of tragedy in this book, a fair amount of triumph as well, but a fair amount of tragedy. And we also get to learn about like extended family and these little offshoots called footnotes. And sometimes that kind of really sprawling, like patchworky things, it doesn't work. I fall out. For me, I fall out. But I thought that this book did a pretty good job of holding it all together. It was very character and plot driven. And it was in York. Oh man, I've been in Yorkshire a lot in my last reading. And it was in Yorkshire. And I do like coming of age. And whenever we get a young protagonist, I like coming of age, particularly of girls, because there's not much, right? And I like coming of age and girls who have tenuous relationships with their mothers as they're looking to them to like form ideas of womanhood, and like the mothers are still trying to just survive, as women and then as mothers. And yeah, I think this book is quite commercial. I think it would have a pretty wide audience. And if you like sort of multi-decade, um, including coming of age, a lot of look at like the war in between the wars and in between wars, and even before that, like at York. So there's quite a bit of setting in this book as well. Yeah, I think I would generally, I have several people, I might ask if they want this book, or at least throw it up as a recommendation. More and more, I come from I meet people who read digitally. Listen, the accessibility of digital books, besides just being able to carry them around multiple ones in one location, but also, I say it over and over, the font, being able to change font types and background, it's important, and I think, yeah, and I'm glad that it exists. Interesting enough, and also in conversation, The Mercy Step, which is on the Women's Prize for Fiction long list by Marcia Hutchinson, is another coming of age. It's set a little bit later. It's also England. We're starting in the 1970s. And it's Bradford. It's Bradford. So we're still in the north. And this is a Jamaican English. Parents are immigrants from Jamaica. Child. And it's really, we stay in childhood, like it's a child's story, which is really hard to do for adult audiences. I think adult authors write children's books for children, all of the time quite successfully, but to really nail a complexity for an adult audience in sort of like the context of literary fiction under a child's voice is hard to do. And I think for the better part of it, Marcia Hutchinson does a good job of it. It was really interesting, again, to kind of listen to these two young women's stories, both from the north of England, kind of overlapping time periods, but from different race ethnicity backgrounds. It was a great conversation to have together. I highly recommend it. If you have a chance to read The Mercy Step and Behind the Scenes at the Museum in Similar Times, I could recommend that as well. Marcia, I did this on audiobook. I don't know if you noticed. And Marcia Hutchinson herself reads it, which I find in a lot of cases when the author reads it, it's quite impactful. I really like authors to read their books to themselves, even if they aren't the best sort of voice actors. I was more sort of endeared to the story, hearing her own voice reading. I do have to admit, we start with the womb. We start with like a womb, which is like a testament that this is we start with birth, someone coming out of the womb and having like their first memories and voice. And that's a testament to like, it's a literary device to say that this is a human who has this will to survive and a voice and meaning from the very beginning. And it's really talking about like not marginalizing voices all the way through a human life experience. But I found it, almost gimmicky. It was actually a struggle for me to get pulled into the book, because I was like, I don't know, is that working for me? I felt it obviously didn't, to the point that I had to like talk myself into like, why is that not working? But once it got going, I could, appreciate where it was going. And I appreciated a lot of what Marcia Hutchinson had to say. I also, really did appreciate, I mean, in any coming of age, we have to address that moment when, we realize that our parents or our idols, normally our parents, aren't, they're flawed. They're flawed humans. I also appreciated The Mercy Step. Definitely raises some criticism, like the other Women's Prize for Fiction book, which was Dominion, about religiosity and just like how sort of like religious fanaticism, can go too far and can have real consequences on real lives. There was a lot of brutality and a lot of violence, and a lot of violence perpetrated, like male violence, in the Mercy Step, and with a lot of the Women's Prize for Fiction books this year. And I have to admit that by the time I started reading Flashlight by Susan Choi, I had some like violence, trauma, and brutality fatigue. Now, I fully understand that in order to even be able to say that, well, in fact, in order to be able to read leisurely about it or scholastically about it, I'm in a position of extreme privilege compared to those that are living through it. And so I want to acknowledge that. I also want to acknowledge that I read the short list from last year and this year, and it just felt like a lot more, a different kind of exploration of humanity and triumph than the picks this year. And I have my fatigue, I guess. I just have brutality fatigue. I do. Here's what I'm going to say about this book. I think if you've listened to anyone review Flashlight by Susan Choi, you've probably heard, like, there were especially the middle parts, like, I was just like, why? Why? Like, would it be an interesting, even short story on its own, but how did it serve this novel? And I even thought some of the characters were maybe not necessary for the purpose of maybe what I wanted to get out of this novel. So and this is what happened with Trust Exercise too. It really was the last third of this novel that I was like, oh, here's the story. Here's the intrigue. It actually became somewhat of a thriller. No, maybe more suspense. I would say more of suspense. And I did like the I like the metaphor of the flashlight and its appearance, and I thought that was done well. I agree with many people when they say Susan Choi can write a fantastic sentence. I didn't recently someone asked, would you recommend the novel? And I said, maybe it's just that fatigue that I just was explaining to you earlier, or maybe just no. I don't know. Now, this book is on the short list, and it has shown up for other prizes. So, some others are finding virtue in this book, although I can't imagine anyone not having this similar feeling that, like, some of the middle parts, maybe just too much. But, like what I said to my friend was, I don't know if I could recommend it. I don't know. I think it's one of those that I'm going to have to sit and think about longer. And again, maybe is it worth it for the last third of the book? The last third of the book for sure. This was an interesting book to read. Also on the long list was A Beast Links Towards Beijing. And A Beast by Alice Evelyn Yang. Yeah. In both cases, we're looking at Japanese imperialism and occupation, totalitarianism, the prices that individuals paid for sort of a regime. We have young characters. We have multiple perspectives in both of those books that are impacted by generational trauma and the secrets that are kind of kept through the generations, like not knowing the stories of the trauma, but experiencing the trauma. And in those ways, those books were quite similar. This really focuses around, like, this is a telling of, well, both of them, they're really quite historical fictions. This is really focusing on what we can't see, and the flashlight metaphor, whereas the beast slinks towards Beijing is really engaging with sort of folklore and magic realism in a way that I sometimes liked and sometimes didn't. By the time I was reading and getting through Beast Slinks Towards Beijing, I don't even think I could give that book full credit. Again, I had so much just like brutality, and that book is brutal. The Beast Slinks Towards Beijing is incredibly brutal. There's a lot of grief and there's a lot of illness in all of these the Women's Prize long list books this year, and those are all things, human conditions that are prevalent, that need to be explored through literature, but just kind of reading them in that kind of concert with each other in volume. So I don't know if Beast Slinks Towards Beijing, if I could really give it full credit even in my reading of it. If you like magic realism, you can handle a fair bit of brutality, then for sure, it's worth picking up. The River Has Roots by Amal El-Mohtar. Okay, like This Is How You Lose the Time War, I could never fully immerse myself into this book. It was a lovely little book. I really appreciated the illustrations in the book. They really lent themselves to, I read this in a beautiful place on a beautiful day. It really lent itself to an enjoyable read in the physical. This is really, I don't even know if I would call it a novella. It was a short story. So had I not got this book on, for $3, I might have felt disappointed. I understand she has her fans. This is the kind of writing that would have, and I said that when I read This Is How You Lose the Time War, that this would have sort of like a fan group. There are fairy tale elements, and it definitely reads like a fairy tale. For me, some of it felt gimmicky, and I think that's partially why I couldn't really immerse myself in it, but I'm also really not a fantasy reader, and there's a lot of poetry, there's a poetic device in this as well. Some of it that worked for me, and others that, again, I just kind of felt a little bit gimmicky for me. Buddy read this, actually, and the person with who also read it at the same time that I did had similar sort of feedback, that they, for what it was, they liked it. They were happy to have read it. I feel the same, but couldn't fully get engaged. And this is definitely something I'll be happy to pass on to for the folks who would be Amal El-Mohtar. Mohtar certainly has fans, Okay, finally, These Impossible Things by Salma Wardani. This book was a kind of a shift. It was a shift. And here we have, I'm going to call them emergent adults. It's that phase of life, especially for folks who go through university, where adulting gets real post-university, and you're adulting. You're sort of the levity of being able to make different choices, and not really understanding the full weight of the consequences hasn't caught up yet. But as you choose your path in life, you start to realize, all of the sliding doors that close, and then you're going down this path, and that's kind of formed, where you're going to keep heading. And it's that phase in life where we have a group of friends who are working through relationships, really. It's a very hetero book. And religious identity and cultural identity and feminine identity, and really trying to understand like what it's like to mature, to really adult in friendships. There is some relationship stuff in here that as an older adult, I'm just like, oh, hell no. And like, I don't need to be, I don't need to front. Like, I had my moments as well in these kinds of relationships. And what I liked is it's the brutal sort of honesty of how relationships can be really romantic in some lights and then really dysfunctional, bad, or not necessarily what someone wants. They might not age well. I liked that. I liked how Samal Wardani handled that. I also thought this book would be, and there are like discussion questions, and I haven't read them, but I thought this would be a sort of like great book for someone who isn't exposed to a whole lot of diversity and just needs exposure to that every group of people are not a monolith, that there's a huge tapestry of ways to be in this world, and that identity is often a bunch of intersections of important parts that negotiate with each other throughout our whole entire lives. And yeah, I think if you're someone who's exposed to religious diversity, if you grew up sort of like around sort of Christian centricity or hegemony, then this could be a good read to just kind of experience that. And I think that might have been some of the intention of the author, but it also, like, I could be assigning too much. This is a book about young women coming into like what I like, really coming into adulthood. So I can't even say new adult, like that phase into like, adulting is getting real, and figuring out life from there, and relationships. Yeah, and friendships. It reminded me a little bit of Angela Flournoy's book, The Wilderness, which I read this year as well. The Wilderness was through multiple decades, and this is pretty condensed. It's just like in a few years of their life, like that post-university period. But commercial, accessible, character and plot driven, pretty well kind of read, and definitely recommendable to folks that kind of like that. And it was a good sort of shift from all of this, like, I mean, that's heavy enough. Relationships are heavy enough. Having your family like not speak to you because your choices disappoint them is heavy. It's real heavy. The kind of brutality that existed in Beast Links towards Beijing, Megha Majumdar's Guardian of the Thief, like some of the the violence that was happening in a lot of the Women's Prize for Fiction books right now was a different kind of story. So this shift into this sort of like, oh, don't get me wrong, there's murder in this as well, but into sort of another world or fairy tale, and then into this kind of real contemporary exploring friend fiction was a nice shift. Where am I going next? I don't know. Like, even just thinking about all of that reading, I almost feel like I just kind of need to not read for a few days. Take a few days off. I'm listening to 2 books right now. I'm not even gonna tell you what they are. I'm enjoying both of those listens. So maybe it's just kind of chill and, go on some walks and listen to some books and give give this other a rest. I have still a huge TBR, but I'm willing to kind of slow things down and let things go right now, so that I don't feel, fatigued, and that's kind of how I'm feeling, not from reading, just from like yeah, the amount of brutality that I have ingested. Um, or I just might have to make a shift to some cat books or the Guncle, the part two of the Guncle, something like that. Anyway, um, until next time, happy reading.